Migrating, consolidating, and upgrading. In this nugget, we're going to talk about some of the general concerns behind either a migration, a server consolidation, or a server upgrade. We'll talk specifically about some of the instance and database configuration options you can use to make your migration, consolidation, or upgrade a little easier. And we'll specifically talk about some of the concerns of an in-place upgrade. There are definitely a few little gotchas. In fact, to make sure that you're really familiar with the in-place upgrade process, we'll actually walk through a complete in-place upgrade from a previous version of SQL Server to SQL Server 2008. Let's get started. So there are three basic scenarios that we're going to discuss in this nugget. The first is a migration, going from a machine that's running a different version of SQL Server to SQL Server 2008. Now, that can also involve moving from one machine running 2008 to another machine running 2008. For example, if you get a bigger server and you want to migrate your databases over to that. Kind of similar is the consolidation scenario. That's where we're taking multiple servers and moving them to a single server. Those multiple old servers might have been running older versions of SQL Server, or they may have been running SQL Server 2008, and you're just trying to get rid of the number of servers that are physically sitting in your data center and consolidate them onto a single machine. Now, the last scenario is an upgrade, which specifically means taking a machine that's running an older version of SQL Server, getting rid of that older version, and upgrading it in place to SQL Server 2008. So those are sort of the three main scenarios, and those are the terms that we're going to use for them. I'll try to use them fairly consistently. Migration, consolidation, and upgrading. Now with an upgrade, you purposefully get the fewest number of options. When you're doing an upgrade, let's say you've got a single computer, and on that you've got an instance of SQL Server 2005 and another instance of SQL Server 2005, and heck, maybe you've got an instance of SQL Server 2000. You're only going to upgrade one of these at a time, usually. And SQL Server definitely supports that scenario. If you're running 2000 over here for some specific reason and you need to keep running it, for the most part you can, and it won't create any issues. So you're going to upgrade each instance. When you upgrade an instance, you really get very few options. You cannot add or remove any features. You are just upgrading exactly what's there. Now, if you need to upgrade it and add features, it's really two steps. The first step is to do the upgrade, and you're going to run through pretty much the same installation process, which we're going to see at the end of this nugget, that you did to install SQL Server. After the upgrade, you can come back and add or remove SQL Server features if you want to. So it's really a two-step process if you're not doing it, just staying exactly with what you've got. Upgrade first and then add or remove features. Now there are some other concerns that you're going to run into if you're doing a consolidation or a migration. The first is how many instances. Now let's say we're doing a migration. Let's say we've got a machine and it's got one instance of SQL Server 2005, another instance of SQL Server 2005, and another instance of SQL Server 2000. That's on server A. We're going to migrate to server B. We've got to decide what to do with each of the original instances. Are we going to set up a single instance of 2008 and migrate both of our 2005 instances into it, and then maybe leave that SQL Server 2000 instance on server A? Or maybe we're going to migrate it to a separate instance of SQL Server 2008. All of the instance planning things you've already learned still apply here. You really, when you're doing a migration, should not worry so much about what your original instance setup looks like as worrying about why it looks like that. And then you can decide if those reasons still apply and if they mean you need a separate instance of SQL Server 2008. Let's take an example here. Let's say that this first instance of 2005 was my default. And let's say that this second instance was one that I actually migrated onto this computer from another one. And the reason I left them separate is because they've got different people who are really responsible for them. So I wanted different top-level instance-wide administrators. All right, so now in my new world, maybe those different groups of people in my company have combined and they all work for the same people, and so there's not really a reason to have these be separate anymore, and so I might just choose to consolidate them into a single instance, just so I have fewer bits of configuration to worry about. There might be times when you really want those to be separate, though. For example, let's say I've got my first instance here, which is the default. My second instance was migrated over to this machine, and let's say that the databases that it's running are running a lot of internal code, stored procedures, and so forth that's not really stable, and we have a lot of maintenance issues with that. Well, in that case, I might want to keep those on separate instances on the new computer as well, just for stability purposes. So again, all the reasons that we talked about in a previous nugget about why you might have different instances still apply here. Just when you're doing a migration, make sure that you're thinking about the reasons why you had multiple instances to begin with, and make sure that those reasons still apply, or can you consolidate them down to fewer instances? The same things really apply in a consolidation scenario. If I've got server A and I've got server B, let's say server A is running one instance of SQL Server 2005 and another instance of 2000, and SQL Server B is running two instances of 05. The right way to look at this is to forget about the fact that they're separate servers. What we're dealing with are four instances of SQL Server. If my new server is server C, what's the best decision for those four instances? If I had decided that, I've got this instance and this instance basically for performance reasons. They're both running mostly the same databases, let's say, and the only reason I had split them across two servers was so that I could get about half of my users using one of them and half of my users using the other. Well, now that I've got this awesome new 8-way 64-bit server with gigs and gigs of memory, I don't really need that separate hardware anymore. I can take both of those instances and bring them together on a single instance on the new server, thereby consolidating not only the server hardware, but also consolidating the SQL Server instances. Now let's say that this old SQL Server 2000 instance is one that I just never really bothered to upgrade it. I could upgrade it though. So, oops, that's supposed to be 2008. So let's say I'm going to have another instance of 2008, because there are still separate people who need to administer this, and I'm going to migrate that instance to this instance, and I might set some of the compatibility settings here so that this instance runs in SQL Server 2000 compatibility mode, something we're going to take a look at in just a sec. Now finally, I've got this instance of SQL Server 2005. And let's say that was really only out there because it was set up by a separate work group and they came in and they don't really care who manages it. It was easiest to keep it separate at the time. Now, if I can't find any compelling reasons to keep it separate, maybe I want to consolidate that onto that instance of 2008 that I'd already created. So I'm consolidating from two servers to one server and potentially from four instances to two instances. The moral here is to look at why each instance exists in the first place and decide if it needs to continue its existence as a separate instance on the new server. So those are some of the concerns and things you need to think about as you're doing either a migration or a consolidation. Another one is configuration. Remember when we go into SQL Server Management Studio and we'll connect, we've got certain top-level instance-wide configuration properties that we need to worry about. Some of them are things like the authentication mode. So if you've got two instances on old servers, and one of those instances you only want to run in Windows Authentication mode, but the other instance needs to run in SQL Server and Windows Authentication, what we call mixed mode, well, when you migrate those, they're going to have to stay on separate instances. So if one of them, for example, you don't want any login auditing, but for some kind of compliance reason, the other instance, you need to audit all kinds of login stuff, both failed and successful, well, that might be a reason to leave them on separate instances on your computer. So in addition to looking at all the normal instance things, security, configuration, everything else, you really have to look at how each of your existing instances is configured at an instance level and determine if two instances configurations can live together or if they need to be kept as separate instances to retain their unique configurations. In fact, let's jump back in there and look at some of these instance-wide configuration properties that you might specifically need to look at. Typically, memory and processor configuration are not going to be a concern. Security configuration might be. That might be something two instances differ on. Either the authentication mode, the level of login auditing, stuff like that might be different from instance to instance. Connections, usually not an issue. Database settings also usually not an issue because these simply serve as defaults. You can, by and large, change these on a per database level. So if you have two different instances and they've got different settings here, usually those can be combined because they don't actually affect the production of the server. These just become defaults. Permissions might be something. If you've got an organization where one group of people needs to be the top level managers of an instance and a separate instance has a different group of people who need to be the top level administrators, well, that's a reason to keep those two instances separate. Some of the subtle things you'll see, though, is on this Advanced tab. Things like allowing triggers to fire other triggers. Things like the full text upgrade option. Things like the 2-digit year cutoff. These are all settings that can affect the applications which are connecting to the instance. Because these are instance-wide settings, if you've got two instances that have different requirements here, they're going to have to stay two different instances in order to maintain that unique configuration. Now, when you migrate an instance, you're not only migrating the instance of SQL Server, you're also migrating or consolidating all of the databases that live in that instance. So there are some per database configuration properties that you need to be aware of. Typically, where these come into play is down here on Options. If I'm migrating or consolidating a database from an instance of SQL 2005 to an instance of SQL 2008, I may want to go into that database and set the compatibility level down to the level of SQL Server it came from. What that does is it takes a lot of the behaviors that have changed from version to version and makes this copy behave like the older version. Now, this is not something you automatically need to do. Just because a database came from SQL Server 2005 does not mean it is automatically incompatible with SQL Server 2008. You and either the database vendor, the application vendor that created the database, or your developers need to sit down, go through the SQL Server documentation, and look at the things that are affected by the compatibility level. Typically, you want to run at the highest compatibility level unless there's a specific reason to downgrade. If you and your application vendor or your database developer sit down and look at the list of compatibility issues and say, oh, here's a behavior in SQL Server 2008 that differs from 2005. We're depending on the 2005 behavior. We can't change the application right now, so that's a reason to set the database compatibility level lower. Most of the other database options will come over normally. Before you migrate or consolidate, just go into the administrative interface on the old instance, sort of document what all these settings are, and then you'll know what to set them to. You're going to find that databases in SQL Server 2008 have more options. There will be things in here that didn't exist on the old version. Typically, you're just going to leave them at the default, and obviously your application isn't relying on them, so it's not critical that they be in any one particular setting. So once you've sort of figured out how many instances you need, and you've documented the instance and database settings that you need to have going forward, you can start actually consolidating and migrating information. Now, there's a couple of interesting techniques you've got available to you. Let's sort of review the fact that when you do an upgrade of an instance, let's say this is SQL Server 2005, you are only going to do an upgrade of the entire instance. You're wiping out 2005 and replacing it with 2008. That's an in-place version upgrade. With anything else, where you're going from one instance, whether it's 2005 or 2008 or whatever, when you're going from one instance to another, typically you're not going to migrate the entire instance all at once. Instead, you're going to migrate individual databases one at a time, which is kind of nice because it lets you do things in a very phased approach. Certainly if you want to, if your operational requirements give you the time and the flexibility and everything else, you can migrate all of the databases out of an instance into another instance, but you're still, even though it's all going to take place at the same time, you're really going to specify it all on a per database basis. Let's take a look at one of the easy tools you've got for doing that. One of the difficult tools is called SQL Server Integration Services. It's something we're going to look at in a later nugget, but for a very straightforward, I need to get this database out of instance A and I need to get it into instance B. Let's look at sort of the tool set you're going to use to do that. Now, one way, and this is certainly the most primitive way, is to go into your old instance's administrative tools, right-click the database, and script the database. That really just takes all of the data structure, and optionally you can get the data out of there as well, dumps it into a clear text file, which can be enormous, and then you pick up that script, copy it over to your new server, and then run that script on the new server. That recreates the database and inserts all the data. It's not terribly efficient, but it is certainly very easy, especially if you've got a database that's not particularly huge. Maybe it's a product category or catalog that only has 10, 20,000 rows, or an employee database that only has a couple thousand rows. It's certainly easy, and it's easy to back out of. If for some reason running the script goes wrong, well, you delete the newly created database on the new server, and you've still got the old one sitting right there, and nothing has happened to it. Nothing bad has happened to it. That's the neat part about SQL Server migration is, generally speaking, they're non-destructive. The old database just sits there, and it's always there, and you can always roll back to that and start over. Now, the other technique you've got involves going down to this Management tab here. I'm going to right-click it and say Copy Database. This only works if you're really coming from SQL Server 2000 or 2005 to SQL Server 2008. You're not going to use this to consolidate non-SQL Server databases. Basically what you do is you specify the name of the source server and authentication credentials, the name of the destination server and authentication credentials, and then decide what you want to do. Now, the first is the detach and attach method. What that does is it goes to the source server, detaches the database, which means it becomes unavailable for anyone to use it. That's actually not bad. It means that the database becomes a static. It's stable. It's not going to be changing in the middle of things. It copies the database file over to the destination server and attaches it to the new instance. The other way is to use the SQL management object. It's a little slower, but it allows the source database to remain online. Now, let's sort of walk through that. You can pick the databases you want to copy. You can either move them, which deletes it on the source server, and there's reasons to do that for security purposes, certainly. I don't like to do that, though. I like to copy it, because it means if something goes wrong, I can always go back and start over with the original. If everything went right, it's not that big of a deal for me to go to the original instance and manually delete the thing. So you can pick the databases you want to copy. Notice that because I've specified a copy to and from the same server, it's telling me that this database already exists at the destination. So I need to come up with a new name for it. It suggests the same database name with _new. Now, just like creating a new database, it's going to allow me to specify the files I want this to go to. This is a neat way to migrate all of the objects in a database to a different file structure. If I had the database spread across multiple files, I can actually consolidate those into single files. So you also have a choice. Let's say I've done this before and I've already got a database _new, but I don't want it anymore. I can say that's okay. Drop the database on the destination and then continue with the transfer. In other words, overwrite it. So we'll click Next. This is going to set up an integration services package, which actually does the work for me. Click Next, and let's run it immediately. Here we go. Now, because this is local, it's going to happen very quickly. Also, because it's such a small database, it's going to happen very quickly. And the neat part about this status screen is you can see exactly what's going on, and you can see if any errors occurred. You can click on the error message. What was the problem? Oh, SQL Server agent isn't running. Well, SQL Server Agent is required to run integration services packages, and all of these copy database operations get built as integration services packages. So we need SQL Server Agent in order to actually run them. Now, because SQL Server Agent wasn't running, it couldn't do it. So let's actually just go back. We can click out of the wizard and start SQL Server Agent. Great, that is up and running. Now let's hit finish on our copy wizard again, and this time because SQL Server Agent was running, it looks like everything got started correctly, and it is executing the job to transfer our database or to copy the database. And as I sit here, I can hear the hard drive spinning furiously in the background. And we're done, so I can hit close. And if I come up to databases and hit refresh, there's my copied database. So that's probably the most straightforward way to just grab an entire database out of an older instance of SQL and bring it over to a new instance of SQL, even across different servers. Now, what if you need to move data from another type of data source, maybe Microsoft Access or even like a MySQL server or an Oracle server? Now, the trick is to dive into the Start menu and look for the Import and Export Data tool. This is called the Data Transformation Services wizard, and it really used to be built into the Management tool, but it's not called Data Transformation Services anymore, and now it's exposed as a separate tool. Works pretty much the same way. The difference is instead of just copying between SQL servers, you can specify all different types of data sources. You can see I've got OLADB connections for Oracle. Any drivers for databases that you have installed on your computer will work. There's Microsoft Access and so forth. I'm not going to walk through this entire process because how it works really depends, and what you see really depends on the data sources you're working with. But the general gist of it is you specify a data source, specify a destination, specify the things you want to copy. Usually you'll want to grab an entire database and all of its data if you're doing a consolidation or migration. And sit back, cross your fingers, and let SQL Server do all of the work. So I've restarted SQL Server 2008 setup, and I've already let it run through all of its little preliminary checks and making sure all my prerequisites are there. So we're going to go right to the Installation tab, and this time we're going to upgrade. Now, some of these upgrade operations, the preliminary checks as well as the actual installation, can take some time. So just as I did with the original SQL Server 2008 installation, I'll be pausing the recording occasionally and just coming back in to cover each step that we're on. So we'll let it run through its initial rule check here. Everything passed. Excellent. That means we're ready to perform the actual upgrade. Now, it says it has to install some setup support files, but this is probably going to go fairly quickly because the majority of this has already been put onto the computer from a prior setup. Oh, yeah, so that went really fast. Okay, next we're just going to get sort of a rule check. Again, as with the original setup, we get a warning that we're on a domain controller. It's not recommended, but since we're in a lab, we're going to go ahead and stick with it. So we're going to move on to next. We'll get the product key in there. We will accept the license terms. And now we select the instance that we want to upgrade. Now, I have an instance on here called App1. That's the only thing I have to choose from. There's another instance of SQL Server 2008 already running on this computer. But because I started setup in upgrade mode, it only wants to upgrade older versions. So it looked and it found that SQL Server 2008 version, which is MS SQL Server, but it found a version 9, which is SQL Server 2005, named App1. So we are going to just upgrade that particular instance. Now, just as with a full installation, we do get to go through this feature selection. Unlike a full installation, we don't get to select any features. It's going to automatically upgrade all of the features that are installed. Now, let's say I wanted to add integration services to this installation. I need to go through the entire upgrade process, complete it, then come back and run setup again to add more features to this instance. You can't add any features while you're upgrading the existing ones. So it's also going to default to the same instance configuration. We're just going to leave all of this the same. The idea is to upgrade this in place and not have it operate any differently afterwards. So it looks like we're good on disk space. Move on to server configuration. It's going to default to using the same local system account that I had set up. The SQL full text filter is going to be set to a manual start. It's then going to look for a full text upgrade. And you've got an option here. Now, I didn't have a lot of full text indexing going on my old SQL Server 2005 instance. But if I did, there's a couple things I could do. The default is to import. So all the full text catalogs or indexes that were created under SQL Server 2005 can be imported, brought in, upgraded to SQL 2008. That can take a little bit of time. Another option is to simply rebuild all of those full text indexes from scratch. This will result in somewhat better performance because there are new word breakers. The word breakers are the things in full text searching that kind of take a block of text and break it up into individual words. This is going to take a lot of time. It will use a lot of CPU. It will use a lot of memory. And none of this is actually going to happen until after the upgrade. So the third option is to reset the full text catalogs. It's going to take away the files, but it's going to keep the metadata and the full text indexes. So after the upgrade is complete, those full text indexes are empty and we have to manually issue a full population. So probably the fastest is the import, but it gets you the least performance in the end. So I'm going to select import because I don't actually have any full text indexes. So it's just kind of an easy way for me just to get past this dialog. Okay, now it's going to check the upgrade rules to make sure that everything is good. Let's take a look at the details while it does that. Looks like everything worked. Wonderful. And so we're ready to upgrade. Let's go. And after a suitable period of time, the setup process is complete. We have upgraded our instance to SQL Server 2008, and now we're ready to upgrade any other instances that might be on the computer, or just close setup and start using SQL Server. In this nugget, we've looked at migrating, consolidating, and upgrading to SQL Server 2008. We covered some of the general concerns, including the 3 different scenarios of migration, consolidation, and upgrading. We looked at some of the instance and database configuration settings that can support those scenarios, and we talked about some of the specific concerns of an in-place version upgrade of SQL. In fact, you got to walk through that entire upgrade process. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.